There's a feeling that I've found really fascinating since I realized what it was that was actually going on. Throughout my life, I've had moments where I'm sitting down on a quiet afternoon or evening looking for a movie to watch, and I'm in a very specific mood, but nothing that I'm coming across is really scratching the itch. Sometimes it would even feel like I could remember certain things about the movie I was looking for, but not the title of it. But what was actually happening was that I was looking for a movie that didn't exist. It's something that's both been a disappointing realization for me, but also an inspiring one because it makes me kind of want to go out and make those dream movies a reality. But I started to wonder where that was really coming from, and how could it be that with the gargantuan amount of movies that have been made, none of them tapped into the thing that I felt like I needed in those moments. For example, I'm really drawn to the concept of liminal spaces, and the atmosphere of those compilations with weird music hits something in me that nothing else does, and certainly no movie has, but it's hard to translate that feeling out from still images and build a narrative around them without breaking the feeling itself. Kyle Edward Ball's 2023 horror film SKINAMARINK is definitely the closest thing I've encountered to something that managed to succeed at that. But the thing that really makes this movie stand out to me is how it fit itself into a hole that I wasn't even fully aware was empty until I saw the movie, because I simply didn't think that it was possible to translate into a feature film, and that's the feeling of being alone in a quiet house at night as a child, or in its more visceral moments, like a nightmare from childhood that I've long forgotten. There was something so distinctly isolated about some of the dreams I had as a kid, so strangely disoriented and uneasily still, that I had always been fascinated by as I grew out of them, but never realized until I saw this movie just how badly I wanted to see something that could recreate those feelings for me. SKINAMARINK was and continues to be a very divisive movie, with some people feeling like it's a boring slog made for masturbatory film snobs who take pleasure in being entertained by still shots of a blank wall, and some people who are endlessly entertained by still shots of a blank wall. I can absolutely see why this isn't everyone's cup of tea, because it's an extremely specific experience that was not at all concerned with reaching out beyond its direct target demographic, and instead was entirely built to fully realize that distant memory of a childhood nightmare that honestly would not be possible to capture if compromises were made to give this a broader appeal. While I did put it as my favorite horror movie from 2023, and I think I stand by that, it's definitely not something where I'm confused if someone says they don't like it. Kyle Edward Ball began developing SKINAMARINK after releasing a short film called Heck to his YouTube channel in 2020 as a proof of concept for the feature-length film, which would be made on a micro budget of $15,000 that Ball mostly crowdfunded, and it wound up making back its budget 143 times over, with a worldwide box office of $2.1 million, which is an absolutely insane success story for this independent film that was shot in Ball's childhood home. They lit the movie with whatever they had laying around, with many scenes being lit only using a CRT TV. Many of the toys used in the film were actual toys from Ball's childhood, and with the two main characters being based off of him and his older sister, this made for a very personal story and helped in fully selling that childhood experience that Ball was wanting to put to the screen. SKINAMARINK is a really interesting movie because it sort of reminds me of Dark Souls in the sense that you can go through the entire experience, really enjoy it and find it super memorable, but have no idea what the fuck actually happened the entire time, and so you go back and pay more attention and try and make connections where you can, and while you're gonna get somewhere with it if you do that, it still doesn't feel like there's a definite perspective on the film that is the be-all and end-all. It's definitely easier to have a firm-ish grasp on what happens in this movie than it is in Dark Souls, but you get what I'm saying. It's a truly unique experience that only becomes more and more disturbing the more I revisit it. So let's take a look at Kyle Edward Ball's 2023 SKINAMARINK. The film opens by establishing something that helps in understanding what the entire point of the movie is, with Kevin and Kaylee, 4 and 6 years old respectively, playing with what looks to be a tape recorder in the hallway. I wasn't sure what this was at first, but we see it again when Kevin is playing with his toys a moment later. Kevin calls for his father, likely wanting to show him what they're playing with, but he's either asleep or not paying attention to them as a movie plays in his room. Still wanting to play, Kevin goes to his toy bin and dumps some things out on the floor, and after a moment, He seems to be compelled by something out in the hall. After his dad has gone to bed and the silence of night has fallen through the dark halls and stairways of the house, Kevin is drawn out of bed and seems to find something. We're not sure what yet, but whatever it is, it begins to play hide and seek with him, and it seems to draw him near the stairs before starting the game, and a moment later we hear a loud thud and Kevin begins crying out. This sort of embodies what this entire film is about, with this young, innocent child seeking connection with his father who entirely ignores him, then finding it elsewhere and getting hurt in the process. It's essentially about an entity that takes advantage of neglectful parents to exploit and toy with the innocence of young children who are unequipped to safely navigate things on their own and are willing to go along with things that can wind up really hurting them. That story about the exploitation of vulnerable innocence feels like the perfect way to go about handling something that aims to recreate that feeling that drew me to the film in the first place, because while that dreamy liminal tone is important here, the thing that made these moments and dreams so unsettling when I was a kid was that feeling of being vulnerable in a faded version of the home that I took comfort in during the day. Even though I didn't connect all the dots all that well on my first go around and didn't have a strong grasp on the plot points of what actually happened in this movie, I was still so blown away by SKINAMARINK because of how perfectly it recreated something that I didn't think was possible without already being in a dream state and having my mind fill in the blanks with unseeable horrors. The movie was shot digitally, and instead of trying to hide that, they fully leaned into it by cranking the ISO to crazy levels ranging between 26,000 to over 100,000, which is something that would never be done in the vast majority of situations because of how much digital noise is introduced past a certain point. For example, I shoot my videos at 1250 ISO and then drop the exposure during the color correction process. Digital noise is different from film grain in a lot of ways, but one of the big ones is that it's got this sort of green or purple tint to it. It's a very distinct look that's almost always avoided at all costs for a film production, but in the context of what this movie was setting out to do, it actually serviced the story incredibly well. One of the things that I really loved about this is how the motion in the noise made me feel like there were things standing in the dark shadows at times, and while watching in a dark room and getting fully immersed, I would sometimes begin to see a face or an outline of something that would then go away when I noticed that it was just my brain searching for something recognizable in the swirling noise. And the movie actually takes advantage of that towards the end with one of the most bone-chilling scares I've witnessed in years, but we'll save that for later on. This movie is filled to the brim with still shots of empty hallways or super hard to make out rooms with almost no light in them, and it's very uncompromising in the execution of its vision. I always appreciate when something super experimental like this is completely honest and upfront about what you're getting into. Like, they basically give you an elevator pitch of what you're in for, and then you can choose to make a deal and watch through the rest, or you can just drop out if it's not your thing. That brief description that I gave of how the movie sets up its story took me almost no time to explain, but Kevin's fall down the stairs doesn't happen until 9 minutes into the movie. Shots linger for a very long time, the small amounts of dialogue are paced quite slowly and can sometimes be pretty hard to make out, and the passage of time is displayed by just lingering on these quiet shots. It's a very slow-paced movie that requires you to laser focus your attention not only on the visuals, but to an even greater degree on the audio, since that's where so much of the story comes from. We barely know what these characters even look like, since we never see a single clear face in the entire movie, with most of what we see only being from the waist down or from behind. We get the best look of Kevin during a brief moment where he turns his head, but this is the clearest look of any character in the entire movie, and it's a super quick shot that only shows a side profile. You are gonna know within 10 minutes if this is something you wanna sit through an hour and 40 minutes of, because it's pretty much exactly like this the entire time. The thing with SKINAMARINK is that you have to fully agree to immerse yourself in every element of the film. Watch it in the darkest room you can, either on your own or with people who are also willing to be dead silent the entire time. Don't touch your phone a single time, and hell, honestly, this is one of very few movies that I would say might actually be better with headphones than it is even with a solid speaker setup. This movie really leaves it up to you to follow along with the events that take place and offers very little guidance. We only know that Kevin and Kaylee's dad is distracted watching a movie because we can hear the movie. Things like that. There isn't too much to talk about from a technical craft side of things, since this movie is so consistent in its presentation and execution and takes place entirely
in this house.
But that doesn't mean it's poorly executed. We're often very low to the ground since the movie is through the perspective of children, which makes things like doorways feel impossibly tall and imposing, and it makes the viewer feel small and vulnerable, like the space is not designed for the perspective of the characters we experience the movie through. This approach, of course, makes the sound design immensely important, and that aspect of the film is easily one of the most unsettling things. The dialogue can be very muffled and distant, with some lines needing subtitles because they would be impossible to make out otherwise. There is no score to speak of whatsoever, with the soundscape mostly being this steady hiss and whatever Kevin and Kaylee are watching on the TV. Things are very wobbly and distorted, especially with the few spoken lines from the entity, which are absolutely chilling the few times they come up. The way these are done is incredible, feeling like the entity is trying to cover up the sinister nature of its own voice by taking on the ones from the kids' parents, but it can't fully do it, and it sort of shifts between the two voices while the underlying evil can't fully hide itself beneath them. So much of what happens in this movie is stuffed into the sound design and not shown, and it's in some of the soundscape where many questions are raised and at least sometimes answered, like the sound of cracking bones that can be heard in the closet when Kaylee goes to her parents' room. It's a largely sensory experience, which you're either really gonna dig or it's gonna turn you off within 10 minutes. So then the big question before we get into trying to make sense of the narrative is SKINAMARINK actually scary? When I made my video about Lake Mungo, I went out of my way to write a super long intro contextualizing my experience with that film, how subjective fear is, and how your own sensitivities and life experience play into what scares you in media. And yet I still had tons of comments telling me I know nothing about horror and would get scared by the backyardigans because I found Lake Mungo exponentially more terrifying than any other horror movie. So I have come to accept that no matter what I say here, I'm gonna get a lot of those same comments. There is never going to be an objective answer for whether or not a movie is scary, but for me, yes, SKINAMARINK scared the fuck out of me. But what I found really interesting on my most recent viewing was, on top of how unsettling the movie is, I also found it to be so deeply sad. We watch these two young children whose parents fade out of their world and are left entirely on their own, and I love how this opens up this angle for us to watch them navigate the situation in a way that, as an adult, would be so obviously terrifying as doors and windows disappear and chairs stand on ceilings and the night is never ending, but as children who haven't had enough time on Earth to fully understand what the rules are, they react to these things very differently than we would. They see it as strange and unusual, but they don't immediately perceive these things as threats. And because they're used to being told what to do, they're much more vulnerable to being manipulated as toys for this entity to play with. The entire time, I just wanted to swoop in and rescue these two, and I actually teared up at one point from how afraid and vulnerable these kids are. I find it amazing how this movie manages to make lines like "I love you" frightening and tragic because of how it's coming from two children who are grasping onto each other as the only recognizable and safe thing in this terrifying dreamscape. When Kevin sees that Kaylee is afraid after what happened upstairs, his instinct to make her feel better is to bring her a juice box because that's the thing that makes him feel better, and there's something about that innocence that really hits me. Seriously, even as I'm like sitting here writing the script for this video, I'm getting emotional just writing that part. Like it makes me really sad, man. The situation is something that I find inherently frightening and upsetting, and the atmosphere and presentation are things that I find really compelling, but there are also more straight-up scares that I find work extremely well. Kyle Edward Ball is very good at building tension, a lot of which is thanks to how hard it is to make things out, causing your mind to try and fill in the blank spaces with unspeakable horrors, and it's also because of how patient he is with allowing these scenes to build. The best example of this is when Kaylee is told to come upstairs, and she's drawn to her parents' bedroom where she finds her father sitting on the edge of the bed, facing away from her. It's hard to make out at first, and it's also immediately off-putting since up to this point, Our understanding was that the kids were alone in the house after their father disappeared. She's told to look under the bed, and I love how this moment plays with your expectations. We've all been got by the under the bed jump scare over the years, and now we get a lot of movies that try and toy with the expectation by having nothing happen under the bed but bringing the scare once we get back up. But when we go up here, her father is still sitting there, just as he was. It's a nice way of shaking up the foundation under your feet and making things feel more unpredictable. Of course, this isn't something that can be expanded on much further than that, because if you just keep going back and forth, changing nothing, it's going to be like those scenes of people running in Monty Python movies. Then she's told to look under again, and this time when she comes up, her father is gone, but her mother is sitting on the other side, facing away from her as her father was. When she speaks to her, it feels almost like someone who died who's having to work through the fog of death while trying to speak to someone for the last time, and it's a really unsettling moment.
Love you again very much.
This is exactly like the kind of thing that I used to have nightmares about as a kid, which is probably a big part of the reason that it hit me so hard. Now, there's a lot going on with the parents that I'll talk about when we get more into the story, and this scene is perhaps the most important puzzle piece where that's concerned, but outside of its relevance to the story, it's probably the most tension-filled scene of the entire movie. It also has one of very few jump scares in SKINAMARINK, where Kaylee goes towards the closet and we suddenly hear the sounds of bone cracking and whimpering before a hand comes out from the door, and that's the last we get of the scene. It's one of those scenes where I'm pretty sure I burned calories through my entire muscular structure being flexed to its maximum capacity for the entire duration of it. So thank you, Kyle Edward Ball, for helping me on my weight loss journey. The scene where Kaylee's mouth is taken from her for continuously asking for her parents is sickening, largely because of the things that she says as she's drawn into the darkness downstairs. Saying, "I feel strange," is such an unsettling thing because it shows how confused she is here and how she's being exposed to something that was not ever meant to come in contact with a human being. It's vile and it's a really upsetting scene. I love the way that they chose to show that the doors and windows were vanishing by having them appear for a moment, accompanied by these muffled, warbly synth noises, and then vanish, taking the sound with them and leaving us in utter silence. SKINAMARINK also has one of the most impressive feats of any movie I've seen in a long time, because it's the only movie I can think of where a subtitle was a jump scare. With how slow and quiet this movie is, despite the very unnerving feel of it all, you're almost lulled into a false sense of security with the levels of where things are going. So when this little piece of text popped up with the entity telling Kevin to put a knife in his eye, it was a more effective jump scare than the vast majority of actual jump scares. I'm not exaggerating either. I genuinely jumped from being startled by this the first time I saw this movie, and it continues to be such an upsetting and horrifying moment. It's another one of those scenes that's this blend of horror and tragedy, because we have this scared child who doesn't know where his sister went and is afraid and looking for guidance, and he just follows along with whatever this thing tells him to do because he's 4 years old and doesn't know anything else, and it's scared him into thinking that if he doesn't obey, it's gonna hurt him more. One of my favorite shots of the whole movie is also one that's incredibly sad, where we see what looks to be Kaylee sitting in the dark on her own, and with an effect that's so subtle you almost don't notice it happening for a while, she begins to just vanish into nothing. It's like watching someone just take an eraser and wipe away everything that she was, and this also feels like something I would have seen in a dream as a kid. It accompanies a bunch of photographs that were shown from around the house, which depict these distorted, faded memories of the scenes that they captured where everything in them is melting away. Another one of those so subtle you almost don't notice it happening effects is during the scene where Kevin is trapped in this endless hallway as his toys and memories grow further away from him. The crossfades are so gradual that I would realize the transition had happened before I noticed it in the process of happening, and I love that kind of thing. One more scare I want to talk about before we try and make sense of the story. Throughout SKINAMARINK, the intense visual noise from the high ISO values and augmentations in post add a lot of motion, especially in the darker parts of the frame. And something that I found began to happen because of that was that my brain would start to think that something was there. Because it's a horror movie and I'm expecting to see something, the way that the noise swirls around made me literally project my expectations into the nothingness, which is a feeling that I always love when a movie can accomplish. And it's always just like a split-second thing. I'm like, is there something? No, it's not there. But it's so effective. As I said earlier, I'm pretty sure that Kyle Edward Ball was damn aware that this was happening while he was making the movie, because it feels like he intentionally took advantage of the knowledge that I'd spent an entire movie thinking I was seeing something in the dark, only to realize that it wasn't actually there, and then delivered a scare that made me feel like the entity was boring into my soul and would linger after the movie ended. The world has begun to fade and melt away. Reality is totally distorted. Everything is as nightmarish as it can be by this point. And then we get this shot of what looks to just be a purely dark room. And very, very slowly, I begin to think, as I have the entire time, that there's a face staring back at me in the dark. And once again, the movie pulls off an incredibly unique jump scare simply through my realization, once the face becomes more clear, that I am in fact seeing a face in the shadow, and it's a truly terrifying moment. It doesn't move, but it just slowly fades into view, and it remains incredibly vague the entire time, staring straight back at the camera, and at least from what I can tell, it looks to have a deeply sinister grin etched into its face. And when I realized that, it was yet another moment that elevated things exponentially in a second. This is a terrifying reveal, and the shot lasts for almost 2 minutes before the movie comes to a close. And I was ready for it to end after 20 seconds. Not out of boredom, out of panic. This is pure nightmare material that gave me a somewhat similar feeling to the reveal at the end of Lake Mungo, although not quite to the same degree. I remember when I was a kid, there was a room at the end of the hall on the top floor of my Nana's house, and there was a point in time where I was getting really heavily into like footage of supposed ghost sightings and found footage horror movies, so I put my iPod in the room propped up against the TV, and then I left it recording for a while, and I just went and did something else. And I can vividly remember like the feeling that I had while watching back that grainy and silent footage. Nothing ever happened in it, of course, but it was that feeling of something hidden in there, and the dreamy look that came from it being the first iPod to even have a camera on it, so it looked awful and made things way scarier. That feeling that I had while watching that video is the same sort of thing that the horror in SKINAMARINK gives me, and that's something that I really appreciate. So yeah, I find the whole thing pretty unnerving without ever letting up, but it's those moments where it ramps up that make it easily the scariest thing I saw the year that it came out. Something that I found really interesting about SKINAMARINK is how it's honestly become scarier the better I understand what's going on, which I'd usually expect would not be the case since the fear of the unknown is such a huge part of things here. With that in mind, let's try and make sense of what actually takes place inside of this hazy nightmare. So, with Kevin having been injured on the stairs during that mysterious game of hide and seek, they all return home from the hospital, and this is the point when things start to get much worse. Their father is nowhere to be found when night comes, and the children are left entirely vulnerable. One of the things that stands out to me is the way that this movie uses things that the kids engage with, like the cartoons on TV or the toys they play with, as a way to tie in with the events that transpire at the hands of the entity. We have a cartoon about a hotel run by a spider who traps the guests inside of his webs, which is certainly reflected in the movie with how the doors and windows begin to vanish, trapping the kids inside. Then we have the cartoon which loops over and over again, where one of the characters begins to slowly vanish, and once they're gone, it all begins again, which is yet another element that's part of this story, with the lives that these kids knew fading away in a time loop. The doors and windows, the parents, their own faces, photographs, memories, toys, everything that they know is slowly fading away, and the implied time loop also ties into this. I also think that while the heavy emphasis on the toys that the kids play with is of course because that's something that a kid would do in this situation, it's also a way to show how this entity is looking at Kevin and Kaylee as toys of its own, just playthings for it to do with as it wishes. It doesn't start out by attacking them or bringing harm, it just does things that would come off as playful and fascinating to a kid, like the game of hide and seek, making dolls float, or having chairs stand on the ceiling. These aren't things that a young child like this is going to immediately see as a sign of something dangerous, and it's how this thing starts its game with them. There are a couple of different ways to think about this, the most obvious one being that they are just being manipulated by an entity and trapped in its hotel of webs. The movie is using the story about a strange entity that's taking advantage of the fact that these kids have parents who have been neglectful and possibly abusive with them, which we'll get more into, as a way of touching on how being a neglectful parent will cause the child to search for guidance elsewhere and can fall into the trap of going along with things that can really wind up hurting them. Children are very dependent, and they're going to look for a sort of instruction wherever they can find it. These kids are forced into a dark and confusing place where they're trying to navigate a world that they haven't been equipped to deal with because they don't get the proper care from the people who are meant to guide them through it. Kaylee seems to be pretty reserved when it comes to the topic of their mother, which could be hinting at an abusive relationship, and that's emphasized by the fact that when Kaylee calls for her parents, the entity punishes her by taking away her mouth, which certainly reflects an abusive environment where the kids are not free to ask their parents for help. Something that's really important to try and piece together is what's going on with Kevin and Kaylee's parents. First off, it seems that their mother and father are separated. They don't live together, as we learn through the kids only calling for their father when they need something, and by the fact that he had to make a phone call to inform their mother about Kevin's injury. Later in the night, when Kaylee asks where their dad went, Kevin responds with this: "Maybe he went with Mom." To which Kaylee replies, "I don't want to talk about Mom." We also had that strange moment with Kaylee in their bedroom upstairs where we hear the sound of breaking bones coming from the closet. At first, I thought that this was hinting at their mother having taken herself out, but we see their father make a phone call to her at the start, so at least at the beginning of the movie, that isn't the case. What is a possibility, though, is that their mother was mentally ill and potentially became abusive towards the kids, which would explain the separation and why Kaylee doesn't want to talk about her, since it makes sense that the older sibling would have more of a developed vendetta against someone who treated them poorly than a 4-year-old would. I hate having to dance around phrasing like this, but it's unfortunately something I have to do on YouTube, so bear with me. It's possible that their mother wasn't all that kind to herself either, and we see reflections of that sort of behavior all through the movie. The sounds from the closet certainly lean in that direction. We have that scene where Kevin is told to get a really good look at a knife, and we also have this horrifying looping scene towards the end of blood spattering on the carpet, screaming, and then it repeating all over again. My first go around, I thought that this was happening to one of the kids, but I don't actually think that's the case. This is the only scene of the movie where we hear Kaylee call out for her mother, which makes me think that what's actually happening here is a memory replaying over and over again where Kaylee witnessed her mother engaging in, the sort of behavior that led to the separation between her and their father. Also, the fact that I'm pretty sure it's Kaylee's voice and not Kevin's, and by this point in the movie, Kaylee doesn't have a mouth to scream with, makes me think that this is sort of like a traumatic memory. The entity is taking advantage of something traumatic that Kaylee witnessed, and we watch it play out over and over and over again. This could help to explain what she said earlier about not wanting to talk about Mom, because it brings up these horrifying memories. It's a genuinely nauseating and upsetting sequence that was honestly quite an endurance test for me. It is also possible that this was Kaylee being attacked, but I find the other idea much more interesting. In terms of what happens with their father, he sort of just vanishes. He's there, then he's not, then we see him in the bedroom, and that's it. He's gone after that. This may be the entity shoving it in Kevin and Kaylee's faces that their father was never really there for them, probably falling into a hole after what happened with their mother and what his kids were put through, which would help to explain why he doesn't pay attention to them. He's ashamed of what they witnessed, even if he wasn't the one who did it. He probably blames himself for any harm that came to them, and they may also be too much of a reminder of such a painful part of his life. Their mother could have changed after having them into someone who he didn't recognize, so there's a whole other layer of tragedy there where he may even blame them somewhat for the way things went, even if that makes absolutely no sense. When this entity took over their house, it made the father vanish into nothing, because that's essentially what was already happening before any of this began anyway. No goodbye, no final moment that helps explain things. He's just gone. As the night progresses, the grip that this entity has on these two kids begins to tighten, and there are some incredibly upsetting moments that come from this. After hurting himself, Kevin calls 911 to ask for help, and it seems like for a moment he is actually able to break out past the cobweb that's been wound through his world and speaks with someone who says they're sending help, but Kevin realizes that there's no way for anyone to come help because the doors and windows are all gone. And then the phone is transformed into a toy phone, something which prompts Kevin to ask the entity how he did it, to which the entity gives a bone-chilling response. It's so clear that whatever this thing is taking great pleasure in the eternal torment it's subjecting these two kids to. We see another example of that later on once reality has really crumbled apart. Kevin's been walking on the ceiling, following the instructions of the entity out of fear because of what it did to Kaylee when she didn't listen. We see this pile of toys sitting in a room, and the room gets further and further away, pulling the memories of the life Kevin knew away from him and leaving him in a dead, empty, infinite hallway. Kevin asks in another one of those moments that puts me nearly to tears if they can watch something happy. Kaylee has lost her mouth, the entity has destroyed their reality, and this child is searching for something, anything to latch onto that feels familiar or comfortable. And all he's shown is a closed door in the middle of a dark eternity. All he wants to do is escape and return to what life was, but the entity is mocking him by showing how trapped he is. There is another angle to view the movie from, but basically everything we've talked about here is still applicable there. Kevin may have gone into a coma after his fall at the beginning of the movie, and this theme of things fading away forever is essentially his brain losing the life that's left in it, and we watch as his life and memories begin to vanish. What he perceives as the entity is his young brain needing a face to embody the terror that he's feeling as everything slips away, and the events of the movie still remain the same outside of that, but are projections inside of his dying mind instead of events happening from an entity distorting their reality. I don't fully buy into this angle simply because of how clearly the time loop element of the story is emphasized, and that makes more sense within the context of an entity wanting to torment, but it's still interesting. The film comes to a close with that bone-chilling shot I was talking about earlier, with Kevin asking its name twice, only for it to tell him, "Go to sleep." What looks to be a smile on this faded thing's face really ties the whole thing together and leaves things on an incredibly disturbing note, and it left an impression on me that I really don't get often. SKINAMARINK is a very divisive movie, and it's not hard to see why that is, but for me it's something that I've always wanted, and I really can't get anywhere else. Kyle Edward Ball tried something unique, taking inspiration from the huge explosion of analogue horror that I'm a massive fan of, and he created a uniquely nightmarish film that captures a feeling I didn't even think was possible to translate into this medium, and for that I'm incredibly grateful for his work. For his next movie, he's partnered with A24, and while we don't know much about it at this point, we do know that it's called the Land of Nod, which was a place of punishment that Cain was brought to in the book of Genesis after murdering his brother, and I can absolutely see why Kyle Edward Ball wants to play with that material. It is supposed to start filming this March, and I'll be anxiously awaiting to see what this man does next because he delivered an insanely memorable experience. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.